Ayana Crowfeather clutched her infant son closer to her chest as she stumbled across the rocky terrain, her moccasins worn thin from 3 days of walking. The baby, barely 4 months old, had finally stopped crying from hunger, but his silence frightened her more than his tears ever had. Behind her, smoke still rose from what had been her village. The memory burned as fiercely as the flames that had consumed her home. Blue-coated soldiers arriving at dawn, their rifles speaking before their mouths could form words of explanation or demand. Her husband, Running Bear, had pushed her toward the back entrance of their dwelling, pressing their son into her arms with hands that trembled not from fear, but from rage. "Run to the sacred canyon," he had whispered urgently. "Hide until the storm passes. I will find you." That had been 3 sunrises ago, and Running Bear had not come. Ayana paused to catch her breath, scanning the desert landscape that stretched endlessly before her. The sacred canyon her husband had spoken of was still 2 days' walk to the north, through territory she had never traveled alone. Her water pouch held barely enough for another day, and the dried meat in her bag would not last much longer. The baby stirred against her chest, making the soft sounds that meant he would soon need to nurse again. But her milk was growing thin, her body consuming itself to sustain both their lives. She could feel her strength ebbing with each step, each hour, each moment of grief that threatened to overwhelm her will to survive. As the sun reached its peak, she found shelter in the shadow of a large boulder and allowed herself to rest. The baby's eyes opened as she settled down, dark and alert like his father's, studying her face with the serious expression that seemed too wise for one so small. "We will make it to the canyon, little one," she whispered in Apache, her voice hoarse from lack of water. "Your father will find us there," he promised. But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her heart like cold water into a cracked vessel. If Running Bear were alive, if he could follow, wouldn't he have caught up to them by now? The soldiers had been thorough in their destruction. She had seen enough from her hiding place in the rocks to know that few, if any, of her people had escaped. The baby began to fuss, and Ayana opened her dress to feed him, wincing at how tender her body had become. As he nursed, she forced herself to eat a small piece of the dried meat, though her stomach rebelled against food when her heart was so heavy with loss. The afternoon passed slowly, the sun beating down with relentless intensity. When evening finally brought cooler air, Ayana resumed her journey, walking by the light of stars that seemed impossibly distant and cold. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when she heard the first howl. It came from behind her, long and mournful, echoing off the canyon walls. Then another answered from her left and another from her right. Within moments, the night was alive with the voices of wolves, and they were getting closer. Ayana quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs. Wolves were not uncommon in this territory, but they rarely hunted humans unless they were desperate, or unless they sensed weakness. Another howl, this one close enough that she could hear it clearly above her own ragged breathing. The baby sensed her fear and began to cry, his wails seeming to pierce the night air like a beacon for any predator within miles. "Hush, my heart," she whispered desperately, trying to soothe him while scanning the darkness for any sign of the pack. "Please be quiet." But the child was too young to understand danger, too hungry and frightened to be comforted by words alone. His cries grew stronger, more insistent, and with each sound he made, the howls around them grew closer. Ayana broke into a run, stumbling over rocks and through scrub brush, driven by an ancient instinct stronger than exhaustion or despair. She was a mother protecting her young, and that made her more dangerous than she had ever imagined she could be. The first wolf appeared as a shadow against the starlight, padding silently across her path about 30 yards ahead. It was large, probably male, with the lean build of an animal that had known many hungry seasons. It stopped and looked directly at her, yellow eyes reflecting what little light filtered down from the sky. Then it threw back its head and howled, and the sound was answered immediately from all directions. They had found her. Ayana clutched her son tighter and veered toward a cluster of large rocks that rose from the desert floor like ancient monuments. If she could reach them, if she could find a place to put her back against stone, she might have a chance. The baby's cries had become screams now, high-pitched wails that carried across the desert like the sound of prey in distress. More shadows moved in her peripheral vision. The pack was closing in, taking their time now that they had their quarry trapped in open ground. Her legs burned with exhaustion and her lungs felt ready to burst, but Ayanna forced herself to keep moving. 20 more yards. 15. 10. She reached the rocks just as the first wolf broke into a run behind her. Ayanna pressed her back against the cold stone, her breathing so labored she could barely hear the approaching wolves over the sound of her own gasps. The cluster of rocks formed a rough semicircle around her, offering protection from behind but leaving her exposed on 3 sides. The baby had exhausted himself with crying and now lay quiet against her chest, but she could feel his rapid heartbeat and knew he sensed the danger as clearly as she did. The first wolf emerged from the shadows directly in front of her, moving with the patient confidence of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. It was even larger than she had thought, easily 100 pounds, with a thick gray coat and intelligent yellow eyes that studied her with calculating interest. Behind it, more shapes materialized from the darkness. Ayanna counted 5, then 7, then stopped counting as more continued to appear. The entire pack had come, drawn by the scent of desperation and the promise of an easy kill. They arranged themselves in a loose circle around the rocks, just beyond the range of any thrown stone, and settled down to watch. Waiting. They knew she couldn't leave the shelter of the rocks, and they knew she would eventually weaken from hunger, thirst, or exhaustion. The largest wolf, clearly the pack leader, lay down and rested his massive head on his paws, watching her with the patience that came from countless successful hunts. The message was clear. They had all night and all the next day if necessary. Ayanna's hand moved instinctively to her belt, seeking the knife that should have been there. But the blade had been lost during her flight from the burning village, dropped somewhere in her panic to escape with her child's life. She had no weapons except her own body and will. The baby stirred and made a small sound, and immediately every wolf head lifted, ears pricked forward. The pack leader rose to his feet, taking a step closer to test her reaction. "Stay back," Ayanna said aloud, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have nothing you want." But even as she spoke, she knew it was a lie. She had exactly what they wanted: warm flesh, weak prey, the scent of fear that called to every hunting instinct they possessed. One of the younger wolves, smaller but more aggressive than the leader, stood and began pacing back and forth at the edge of the circle. Its movements were quick and nervous, the behavior of an animal working up courage for the first attack. Ayanna picked up a stone the size of her fist and held it ready. The motion caused several wolves to tense, but none moved closer. Hours passed. The baby nursed again, and Ayanna forced herself to eat another small piece of dried meat, knowing she would need every ounce of strength for what was coming. The wolves took turns sleeping and keeping watch, but their circle never loosened. Near midnight, the young wolf that had been pacing earlier made its move. It darted forward suddenly, testing whether she would hold her ground or try to run. Ayanna hurled the stone with all her strength, catching the animal on the shoulder and sending it yelping back to the safety of the pack. The other wolves stirred but didn't retreat. If anything, the successful defense seemed to make them more interested. "I will not be easy prey," she called out, her voice echoing off the rocks. "If you want me, you will pay in blood." The pack leader studied her for a long moment, then stood and walked deliberately to the edge of her throwing range. He was testing her again, measuring her strength and resolve. Ayanna picked up another stone and held it ready, meeting the great wolf's gaze without flinching. For several heartbeats, human and animal stared at each other across the small space that separated them. Then the wolf sat back on his haunches and let out a long, low howl that seemed to carry notes of respect along with the promise of death. The sound was taken up by the rest of the pack, until the night air vibrated with their voices. But there was something different about this howl, not the excited yipping of a hunt, but something more formal, more ceremonial. They recognized her courage even as they prepared to kill her. As the howling faded, Ayanna realized that the nature of the standoff had changed. This was no longer simply predator and prey. It had become something more primal. A test of wills, a contest to see which species had the greater claim to survival in this harsh land. The baby slept against her chest, trusting her completely to keep him safe. That trust gave her strength she hadn't known she possessed. "My son will see the sunrise," she whispered into the darkness. "I promise you that, little one." The wolves heard her voice and stirred restlessly, sensing something in her tone that made them uneasy. The pack leader stood again and took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the individual hairs on his muzzle. Ayana raised her second stone and prepared to fight for both their house, and the attack came just after midnight. The young wolf that Ayana had struck with the stone made another charge, this time accompanied by two others who approached from different angles. They had learned from the first attempt. Instead of coming straight on, they spread out to divide her attention. Ayana threw her second stone at the nearest attacker, catching it on the ribs and causing it to stumble, but the other two kept coming, and she had no more projectiles within easy reach. She pressed the baby tighter against her chest and grabbed for another rock, but the wolf on her left was already leaping toward her throat. Ayana threw herself sideways, using the stone wall to shield the child while lashing out with her free hand. Her fingernails caught the wolf across the muzzle, drawing blood and sending it skittering backward with a yelp of pain. The third attacker circled around behind the fallen rocks, trying to find an angle of approach that would put the baby within reach of its teeth. Ayana spun to face it, snarling with a ferocity that surprised even herself. "Come then," she shouted in Apache, her voice raw with exhaustion and fury. "But know that I am Ayana Crowfeather, daughter of Chief Iron Wolf, and I do not die easily." The words seemed to hang in the air like a physical challenge. The attacking wolves paused, and even the pack leader lifted his head with what might have been interest. For a moment, the desert was silent except for the sound of heavy breathing, both human and animal. Then the assault resumed with doubled intensity. Two more wolves joined the attack, coming from opposite sides while the original three regrouped. Ayana found herself fighting on multiple fronts, using her back against the rocks to protect the baby while striking out with hands, feet, and teeth at any wolf that came within range. She caught one animal across the face with her elbow, breaking its nose and sending it howling into the darkness. Another she kicked in the ribs with enough force to crack bone. But for every wolf she drove off, another took its place. Her strength was fading. The lack of food and water, combined with the stress of constant vigilance, was taking its toll. Her movements were becoming slower, less precise. The pack sensed her weakening and pressed their advantage. The attacks came faster now, more coordinated. They were no longer testing her defenses. They were trying to overwhelm them. A gray female managed to slip past Ayana's guard and snapped at the bundle she carried. The wolf's teeth caught the edge of the blanket wrapped around the baby, tearing away a piece of cloth. The near miss sent Ayana into a rage unlike anything she had ever experienced. With a scream that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, she grabbed the attacking wolf by the throat with both hands, still somehow managing to keep the baby pressed safely against her body. The wolf thrashed and clawed, its hind legs raking bloody furrows down her arms, but Ayana held on, squeezing with the desperate strength of a mother whose child had been threatened. The other wolves backed away, startled by the sudden transformation from defensive prey to avenging fury. Even the pack leader seemed taken aback by the violence of her response. Ayana held the struggling wolf until it stopped moving, then threw the body aside and faced the remaining pack with blood streaming down her arms and wildness in her eyes. "Who else wants to taste my child's flesh?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the desert like a war cry. The pack hesitated. This was not how such encounters usually went. Prey was supposed to weaken and submit, not grow stronger and more dangerous as the night wore on. But they were still hungry, and she was still alone with a helpless infant. After a brief conference of whines and body language, they settled down to wait again. The battle had cost Ayana dearly. Her arms burned from the wolf's claws, and she could feel blood soaking through her dress. Her throat was raw from shouting, and her hands shook with exhaustion. But the baby was unharmed, and the wolves now knew that reaching him would cost them more than they had expected. As the night wore on, the attacks became more sporadic but more vicious. The pack was learning her patterns, testing different approaches, wearing her down through attrition. Ayana fought each assault with everything she had, using rocks, sticks, and her own body as weapons. She bit, clawed, screamed, and threw herself at her attackers with the reckless courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. By the time the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of dawn, 5 wolves lay dead around the rocks and 3 more bore serious injuries. But Ayana was bleeding from dozens of cuts and her strength was nearly gone. The pack leader had not yet joined the attacks directly, content to let his subordinates test her defenses. But as the sky began to lighten, he finally stood and walked forward. He was twice the size of any wolf she had faced so far, and his yellow eyes held the wisdom of countless kills. This would not be like the others. This would be a battle between equals, and only one would see the sunrise complete. Ayanna struggled to her feet, using the rock wall for support. The baby stirred in her arms but did not wake. "Come then, old father," she whispered to the great wolf. "Let us finish this." The pack leader approached with the measured pace of a creature that had never known defeat. His massive paws made no sound on the rocky ground, and his eyes never left Ayanna's face as he closed the distance between them. Around the stone circle, the surviving wolves watched in silence. This was no longer about food, it had become a ritual, a test that would determine not just who lived and who died, but who deserved to claim dominance over this piece of desert. Ayanna shifted the baby to her left arm, keeping her right hand free. Blood loss and exhaustion had made her dizzy, but her vision was clear and her purpose absolute. She would not fail now, not when dawn was so close. The great wolf stopped just beyond her reach and studied her with ancient intelligence. Up close, she could see the scars that marked his hide, evidence of battles won and territory claimed over what must have been many years of leading this pack. He was magnificent and terrible, a perfect killing machine, shaped by countless generations of survival. But Ayanna was something the wolf had never encountered before, a mother defending her young who had transcended the normal boundaries of human endurance and entered the realm of legend. The wolf circled slowly to her right, looking for an opening. Ayanna turned with him, keeping her body between his teeth and her child. The movement made her wounds burn, but she ignored the pain. "You are brave, old father," she said softly in Apache. "Your pack fights with honor, but this child is under my protection and I will not yield." The wolf paused as if he understood her words, tilting his massive head with something that might have been respect. Then he attacked. The charge was lightning fast despite his size, a blur of gray fur and white teeth that gave Ayanna barely enough time to react. She threw herself backward against the rocks, using the wall to support herself while she kicked out with both feet. Her moccasins caught the wolf in the chest, but his momentum carried him forward. His claws raked down her legs as his jaws snapped inches from the baby's head. Ayanna twisted away from the wall and brought her elbow down on the back of the wolf's neck with all her remaining strength. The blow staggered him, giving her enough time to regain her footing. The great wolf shook his head and turned to face her again, a new wariness in his yellow eyes. She had hurt him, not seriously, but enough to prove that she was still dangerous despite her wounds. They circled each other in the growing light, two apex predators testing for weakness. The baby remained mercifully quiet, as if he too understood the gravity of this final confrontation. The wolf feinted to the left, then spun and came in low from the right. Ayanna saw the move coming and dropped to one knee, bringing her fist up in an uppercut that caught him under the jaw. The impact sent shockwaves of pain up her arm, but the wolf's head snapped back and he stumbled. For a moment they were both stunned. Then the eastern horizon began to glow with the first true light of sunrise. The effect on both combatants was immediate. The wolf stepped back, his ears pricked toward the growing light. Ayanna straightened, feeling strength flow back into her limbs as she realized she had done it. She had survived the night. The baby opened his eyes and looked up at her, and for the first time since the village burned, he smiled. That smile seemed to transform the entire desert. The rocks caught the early light and began to glow like jewels. The harsh landscape that had threatened to become her grave suddenly looked beautiful, full of promise and life. The great wolf sat back on his haunches and studied the scene. The bloodied woman holding her child, the sunrise painting everything golden, the sense that something extraordinary had just occurred. Then he threw back his head and howled. But this was not the hunting call or the territorial challenge Ayanna had heard throughout the night. This was something else entirely, a song of recognition, of acknowledgement, of respect given from one warrior to another. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to reach up to the brightening sky itself. The other wolves took up the call, until the entire pack was singing their tribute to courage they had witnessed. When the howling faded, the great wolf stood and walked slowly toward Ayanna. She tensed, unsure whether the battle was truly over, but ready to fight again if necessary. The wolf stopped just out of reach and lowered his massive head in what could only be described as a bow. Then he turned and walked away, followed by the rest of his pack. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the desert, leaving behind only their dead and the memory of the most extraordinary night of Ayana's life. She sank to her knees in the growing warmth of the sunrise, holding her baby close and weeping tears of exhaustion, relief and triumph. She had kept her promise. Her son had seen the dawn, but as she sat among the stones, surrounded by the evidence of her battle, Ayana began to sense that she was no longer alone in the desert. In the distance, barely visible against the morning light, riders were approaching. The first rider crested the hill just as the sun cleared the horizon, his silhouette dark against the golden sky. Then another appeared beside him and another, until the ridgeline was crowded with mounted figures. Ayana struggled to her feet, cradling the baby against her chest. Her vision was blurred from exhaustion and blood loss, making it difficult to count the approaching riders. Were they soldiers coming to finish what had been started at the village, bandits drawn by the sounds of battle, or something else entirely? As they drew closer, details became clearer. These were Apache warriors, their horses painted for war, their weapons ready. But something about their approach was different from what she had expected. They rode not with the urgency of pursuit or the aggression of attack, but with the measured pace of a ceremonial procession. The lead rider was an elderly man whose face bore the weathered dignity of countless seasons. Beside him rode a younger warrior Ayana recognized despite the distance, her brother-in-law, Swift Arrow, Running Bear's younger brother. When Swift Arrow saw her standing among the rocks, he kicked his horse into a gallop and rode ahead of the group. He reached her first, dismounting while his horse was still moving and running to her side. "Sister," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "We saw the smoke, searched for survivors. We feared you were dead." Ayana wanted to speak, but no words came. The relief of seeing family, of knowing she and her son were no longer alone, overwhelmed her completely. Swift Arrow's eyes took in the scene around them, the dead wolves scattered among the rocks, the blood on her clothes and arms, the way she held herself like someone who had fought a war and somehow won. "What happened here?" he asked softly. Before Ayana could answer, the rest of the war party reached them. 70 warriors in all, she realized as they formed a wide circle around the rocks. Each man dismounted and stood beside his horse waiting. The elderly leader approached on foot. This was Gray Eagle, one of the most respected war chiefs of all the Apache bands, a man whose name was spoken with reverence around council fires throughout the territory. "Ayana Crow Feather," Gray Eagle said formally. "Daughter of Iron Wolf, wife of Running Bear, we have come seeking news of our people." "The village burns," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "The soldiers came at dawn 3 days ago. Running Bear told me to run, to take the baby to the sacred canyon." Gray Eagle nodded gravely. "Your husband lives. He leads the survivors to the hidden valley, but he asked us to find you and the child first." The news that Running Bear had survived nearly buckled her knees. Swift Arrow caught her arm to steady her. "But sister," Swift Arrow said, his eyes wide with amazement, "how did you come to be here, surrounded by dead wolves? What battle was fought in this place?" Ayana looked around at the evidence of her night-long struggle. 5 wolf carcasses, rocks stained with blood, the ground torn up from the fighting. "They came in the night," she said simply. "I had no weapons, no help. Only the need to protect my son." The warriors exchanged glances. Several moved closer to examine the dead wolves, studying the wounds, the positioning of the bodies, the clear signs of a desperate fight. "This one died by strangling," observed one warrior kneeling beside the gray female. "These claw marks on her arms, she killed it with her bare hands." Another warrior pointed to the drag marks in the sand. "She fought from this position all night, never giving ground, never allowing them to reach the child." Gray Eagle walked slowly around the stone circle, reading the story written in blood and disturbed earth. When he completed his circuit, he turned to face Ayana with an expression of profound respect. "Warriors," he called out in a voice that carried across the desert, "bear witness to what happened in this place." The 70 men moved closer, forming concentric circles around Ayana and the rocks where she had made her stand. "This woman fought alone against a full wolf pack to protect her child," Gray Eagle continued. "With no weapons save her own courage, she held this ground from midnight until dawn. 5 wolves lie dead by her hand, and the survivors fled before her fury." Murmurs of amazement rippled through the gathered warriors. Several of the younger men stared at Ayanna as if seeing her for the first time. But more than this, Grey Eagle said, his voice rising. She has shown us what it means to be Apache, what it means to fight when all seems lost, what it means to protect what is most precious even unto death. The baby chose that moment to wake and look around at all the faces surrounding him. He seemed utterly unafraid, gazing at the warriors with the calm confidence of someone who had never known anything but protection and love. Grey Eagle approached Ayanna directly. Your son is fortunate to have such a mother. Our people are fortunate to have such a woman among them. Then, to Ayanna's amazement, the great war chief lowered himself to one knee before her. I bow to your courage, he said formally. I bow to your strength. I bow to the warrior spirit that lives within you. One by one, the other warriors followed suit. Swift Arrow knelt first. Then the senior fighters, then the younger men, until all 70 Apache warriors were kneeling in the desert sand. Their heads bowed in tribute to the woman who had fought the wolves and won. The sight was overwhelming. These were men who had never knelt to anyone, warriors whose very existence was defined by strength and pride. Yet here they were, paying homage to something they recognized as greater than themselves. Rice, Ayanna said finally, her voice stronger now. You honor me too much. Grey Eagle stood and shook his head. No, Ayanna Crowfeather. We honor you exactly as you deserve. You have become something more than woman, more than mother. You have become legend. The ride to the hidden valley took 2 days, with Ayanna sharing Swift Arrow's horse and the baby sleeping peacefully in a cradle board, crafted by the warriors from materials they carried. Her wounds were tended by Grey Eagle himself, who possessed considerable skill as a healer. As they traveled, the story of her battle with the wolves spread from warrior to warrior, growing in the telling until it took on the weight of myth. By the time they reached the valley, runners had already carried the tale to the survivors gathered there. Running Bear was waiting at the valley entrance when their party arrived. The moment he saw Ayanna and their son alive and safe, he leaped from his horse and ran to them, tears streaming down his face. The reunion was everything she had dreamed of during the long nights of flight and fear. His arms around her, his voice whispering her name, the baby cooing with delight at seeing his father. It seemed impossible that such happiness could exist after so much loss. I promised I would find you, Running Bear said, holding them both close. But I feared. When we found the trail of the wolves found more than they bargained for, Swift Arrow said proudly. Your wife is a warrior, brother. She fought an entire pack alone and emerged, victorious. The survivors of the village, nearly 300, people who had escaped the initial attack or been away, hunting, gathered around to hear the story told in full. Grey Eagle spoke with the formal cadence of one who understood he was creating oral history that would be passed down for generations. He described Ayanna's flight across the desert, her courage in facing the wolves, the night-long battle that had seen 5 of the great predators fall before her fury. But more than that, he spoke of what her actions represented. In our darkest hour, the war chief said, when our homes burned and our people scattered, one woman showed us that the spirit of the Apache cannot be broken, that a mother's love is stronger than any weapon, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The crowd listened in respectful silence, but Ayanna could see something in their faces that made her uncomfortable. It was reverence, the kind usually reserved for spirits or ancestors. I did only what any mother would do, she protested when Grey Eagle finished his account. My child was in danger. I protected him. No, said an elderly woman whose own grandchildren clustered around her feet. Most of us would have tried. Few would have succeeded. You did not just fight, you won. Against impossible odds, with no help, you prevailed. The wolves themselves acknowledged her victory, added one of the warriors who had witnessed the morning scene. The great pack leader bowed to her before departing. Even the beasts of the field recognize courage when they see it. In the days that followed, as the Apache survivors rebuilt their lives in the hidden valley, Ayanna found that her story had begun to take on a life of its own. Children played games in which they pretended to be the brave mother fighting wolves. Young warriors asked her to describe the tactics she had used, as if her desperate improvisation could be codified into military strategy. Most disturbing of all, some began to speak of her as if she possessed supernatural powers, as if her victory had been the result of divine intervention rather than human determination. "They mean well," Running Bear said one evening, as they watched their son sleep peacefully in his cradleboard. "Your courage has given our people hope when hope was hard to find." "But they're making me into something I'm not," Ayana replied. "I'm just a woman who fought for her child. Nothing more. Are you so sure?" Running Bear asked gently. "Perhaps being just a woman who fought for her child is more extraordinary than you realize." 6 months later, when representatives from other Apache bands gathered for the annual council, Gray Eagle stood before the assembled chiefs and war leaders to tell Ayana's story once again. By this time, it had been refined through countless retellings until every detail carried symbolic weight. The wolves represented the forces that threatened Apache survival: soldiers, settlers, disease, despair. The long night symbolized the dark times their people faced. And Ayana's refusal to yield, her willingness to fight with nothing but maternal love and fierce determination, had become a metaphor for the resilience that would see the Apache through whatever trials lay ahead. "This woman," Gray Eagle concluded, "has shown us that legends are not born in the distant past, but in the choices we make today. She is proof that the greatest warriors are not always those who carry the finest weapons, but those who carry the strongest hearts." The assembled chiefs voted unanimously to adopt Ayana's story into the formal oral tradition of all Apache bands. Her name would be spoken around council fires for as long as their people remembered their history. But perhaps the greatest honor came from an unexpected source. A year after the battle, hunters reported that the wolf pack she had fought still roamed the territory around the sacred canyon. But their behavior had changed. Where once they had hunted fearlessly throughout the region, now they avoided the canyon itself, as if recognizing that the place had been claimed by a greater predator. The local Apache began calling it Ayana's Canyon, and travelers would often find wolf tracks leading up to the edge of the stone circle, where she had made her stand, then turning away without crossing the invisible boundary her courage had established. The wolves remembered, even if they could not speak of what they had learned that night. And in the hidden valley, Ayana Crowfeather continued to live quietly with her husband and growing son, knowing that she had become something she never intended to be. A living symbol of the truth that courage, once tested, becomes eternal. On quiet evenings, when the baby slept and the fire burned low, she would sometimes look toward the stars and remember that terrible, glorious night when she had discovered the depths of her own strength. She had fought not for glory or recognition, but for love, and in doing so had created something that would outlive them all. The legend of the Apache mother who fought the wolves had been born from necessity, forged in blood and desperation, and tempered by the simple truth that some things are worth any sacrifice to protect.